My name is Rhiannon Lark, and at 70 years old I have learned that peace is a habit, not a gift. I live alone in a small house overlooking Rockport Harbor, where the gulls scream over the masts and the sea air leaves a thin film of salt on my windows. Most mornings follow the same rhythm tee first, then a walk, then some small act of tidying that makes the day feel worthwhile. That morning began no differently. Except for the pale blue shawl laid out across the ironing board, I pressed it carefully, easing the wrinkles from the silk, the fabric catching light like water. It was meant for Delia's wedding tomorrow. I had chosen the color because she once said it reminded her of spring skies. My hands ached from arthritis, but I wanted every fold perfect. The bouquet note rested nearby, folded twice. A small wish I planned to tuck among her flowers. For the life you've chosen, may it be kind. The kettle began to hum just as the front door opened. May, my older sister, stepped in with 2 grocery bags and her usual fussing about the weather. I smiled and told her, "Tomorrow's big." I barely slept. I expected a laugh, maybe a reminder not to overdo it. Instead, the color drained from her face. She set the bags down slowly, one slipping to the floor. "Rhiannon," she said, voice trembling. "What are you talking about? The wedding was last week." I thought she was joking, some clumsy attempt at teasing, but she didn't look away. The kettle began to whistle sharply, the sound rising like a scream. May reached for my arm. "You didn't know," she whispered. I didn't answer. The room tilted around me, the shawl, the note. The neat rows of cups on the shelf suddenly foreign. I turned off the stove. The silence landing heavy as fog. May's hand stayed on my arm, steadying me, but the steadiness came too late. The shawl slipped from the board, falling in a soft blue heap at our feet. And in that quiet, I felt the beginning of something breaking. The photo album waited on her kitchen table, still open. May guided me into her kitchen like I was something fragile. The room smelled of coffee and lemon cleaner, the way it always had. But that morning, even the light through the curtains felt off too sharp, too revealing. She set her phone on the table, screen facing down, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. When she finally turned it over, the photo filled the space between us. Delia stood beneath an arch of white roses, the ocean behind her glowing in perfect summer light. Her dress was lace and silk, a soft ivory that shimmered against her skin. The groom, Aaron, I remembered his name only from a few brief mentions, held her hand, smiling like the world had opened for him. Around them, guests clapped, glasses lifted, flower petals scattered. There were faces I hadn't seen in years, neighbors, cousins, even May's daughter, all captured mid-laughter. I waited for my image to appear somewhere in that swirl of color, but it never came. I scrolled through picture after picture, each one a small confirmation of my absence. The phone grew heavy in my hand. May reached across the table. "She told us it would be small," she said softly. "Just close family. She said you wanted it that way. Private." Her words slid over me without meaning. I looked again at the smiling crowd, at my daughter's hand resting on her father's old watch, something she'd taken from my drawer years ago, promising to return it one day. The sight of it turned my stomach. "May," I said, barely hearing my own voice. "You were there." She nodded, tears forming. "I thought you knew. I thought she'd told you." The room seemed to tilt again, edges dimming. I set the phone down carefully beside the sugar jar. My reflection in the dark screen looked like someone I didn't know, older, smaller, suddenly out of place in a story that had gone on without me. May began to speak again, but I only shook my head. There was nothing left to explain. The truth was simple and enormous. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been left out on purpose, outside. A gull cried over the harbor, and I realized the day had already changed shape. That night, sleep would not come. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea. Staring at the shawl still folded on the chair, the house held its silence like a breath. Every tick of the clock sounded like something measuring the distance between who I was and who Delia had decided I no longer needed to be. I remembered the first years after her father's death, the morning the Coast Guard called. The taste of salt in the air when I walked to the harbor. The look in their eyes when they told me they had found his boat, but not him. Delia had been 8. I was 38 and too scared to cry in front of her. Back then, I took whatever work I could. Library mornings, diner nights. I mended torn uniforms, ironed linens, and packed lunches for the fishermen's kids when their mothers couldn't. Every coin I saved went into the glass jar marked college. I used to count it with her on Sunday evenings, teaching her numbers through hope. I can still see her at 16, sitting at this same table, laughing about the future. She had dreams bigger than this house cities, lights, new beginnings. I wanted that for her, even if it meant being left behind. But somewhere along the way, distance stopped feeling like growth. The first time she brought a college friend home, she called my cottage quaint. The second time, she didn't bring anyone at all. The holidays shrank to phone calls, the calls to short texts. She said work was busy, that flights were expensive, that she would come soon. She never did. I tried not to take it personally. I told myself love changes shape. But looking at the empty chair across from me, I could not remember when love had become something she was ashamed to show. The tea had gone cold, long before I realized I was still waiting for her to knock on the door. 2 days passed before I drove to Rockport Heights. The morning was bright and clean, the kind of day that would have once lifted my spirits. The locket I had meant to give Delia lay wrapped in tissue on the passenger seat, its small weight a pulse of memory beside me. I told myself I only wanted to understand, though the truth sat heavier than that. Her new house stood at the top of a quiet hill, a modern thing of glass and cedar. The yard was still raw from construction, soil turned and bare. I parked by the curb and sat for a moment, watching my reflection in the windshield until I no longer recognized the expression staring back. Delia answered on the third knock. Her hair was pinned back, her makeup careful, for a heartbeat. Her face lit in surprise. And then something else alarm, maybe passed through it. Behind her, a man stepped into view. He was tall, polite, uncertain. "Mom," she said, forcing a smile. "You should have called. I saw the pictures," I said quietly. "I thought I'd bring your gift." She opened the door wider, but the invitation was thin. The house smelled of new paint and coffee. On the far wall stood our old piano, the one her father bought the year she turned 12. My hands ached at the sight of it. Delia glanced toward her husband. "Aaron, could you check the roast?" He nodded and disappeared down the hall. She turned back to me, folding her arms. "It wasn't meant to hurt you. We just wanted something simple. Intimate, intimate," I repeated. "You had 50 people there." Her eyes darted away. "You make everything heavier than it is." I placed the locket on the entry table. "You left me out of your beginning," I said. She pressed her lips together but said nothing. The air between us thickened until I stepped back onto the porch. I heard the door close before I reached the car. The click of the latch followed me down the path, like a sentence I could not appeal. The house felt smaller when I returned. The air had a stillness that pressed against my chest. I hung my coat on the peg by the door, then walked straight to the cedar chest in the corner of the living room. It had belonged to my grandmother. Its hinges rusted, its surface marked by decades of hands reaching for keepsakes and proof of ownership. Inside were papers bundled with thin ribbon tax forms, insurance receipts, mortgage statements from years when the numbers barely balanced. I lifted the folder marked Property, its corners soft with age. The paper smelled faintly of dust and salt. My name sat alone on every page, Rhiannon M. Lark typed in faded ink. Unshared. Undisputed. I traced the signature, the curve of my handwriting from the year I signed it, remembering the day I brought the last payment to the bank. The teller, a young man with freckles, had smiled and said, "Congratulations. Mrs. Lark, it's all yours." I hadn't told anyone. I drove straight home, made tea, and sat on the porch until sunset, proud in a way I didn't know how to name. Delia had always spoken of the house as something inevitable, our family place, the cottage I'll inherit someday. I never corrected her. Maybe I thought it didn't matter, that ownership and belonging were the same thing. But holding those papers now, I saw how wrong I had been. I spread the documents across the table, the ink trembling slightly under the lamplight. My life was recorded in these lines, every hour worked, every corner of debt overcome, every choice made alone. The weight of it steadied me. From the drawer beside the chair, I took my journal and opened to a blank page. I wrote carefully. My hand still sore from the drive. Legacy begins with respect, not inheritance. The words looked plain on the paper, but they carried the kind of truth that settles deep, like silt in water. I sat there for a long time before I reached for the phone. Tomorrow, I would call the solicitor in Camden. It was time to look at the will again, to put my name and my intentions in the same place, once and for all, and for ye. The storm came just after midnight, sweeping in from the bay with wind that rattled the shutters and made the house groan. I had been reading on the couch, though the words had stopped meaning anything an hour ago. The rain hit the windows in uneven bursts, and somewhere in that rhythm, my chest began to tighten. It was not sharp pain, only a deep pressure, heavy and unfamiliar. I tried to breathe slowly, but the air felt thick, the kettle on the stove whistled faintly from where I had forgotten it. I turned it off, bracing myself on the counter. The dizziness came in waves, the room shrinking and widening with each breath. I sat down at the kitchen table, pressing my palm against my heart, counting quietly until the world steadied again. When it didn't, I reached for the phone and called for help. At the hospital in Camden, the lights were too bright, the air too clean. A young nurse helped me onto a bed and clipped a monitor to my finger. Her voice was kind, but practiced. "Do you have someone we can call?" "Ma'am A, next of kin." For a moment, my mind went blank. The first name that should have come did not. Delia's number sat in my phone, but the thought of hearing her voice or worse, her silence, was unbearable. I swallowed and said, "My sister. Her name is May." The nurse nodded and made the call. Later, after the tests and the pills, they told me it was not a heart attack, just strain and exhaustion. I signed the discharge forms with a shaking hand while the rain beat hard against the window, a steady drumming that filled the quiet. May arrived wrapped in a soaked coat, her hair plastered to her cheeks. She took my hand in both of hers, warm and trembling. "You're not alone," she said softly. For a long moment, I couldn't answer. Then I looked at her and managed a small, tired smile. I said, "But I'm learning how to stop being outside." The storm began to drift out to sea, leaving only the sound of water easing against glass. A week after the storm, I drove back to Camden with the sea fog still low over the harbor. The town looked washed clean, the kind of morning that pretends nothing has broken. I parked outside the brick building where Clara Baines had kept her office for decades. She had handled my first mortgage, my insurance claim after the accident, even the small legal details of Delia's college grants. When she saw me in the doorway, she smiled in the familiar, practical way of someone who has watched you age one signature at a time. "You look better," she said, motioning me to sit. May told me you gave us a scare. I'm fine, I said. Just overdue for a few things. We spent the next hour reviewing the old will, each clause a reminder of a woman I no longer was. The original draft named Delia as sole heir to the house and my savings. Reading it now felt like looking at someone else's handwriting. I asked Clara to prepare a new version. The coastal home and my accounts would go to the Rockport Literacy Trust, a program for the children who came into the library every summer asking for stories about the sea. Whatever remained would pass to May's grandchildren, the only young faces that still visited my porch without reason. Clara took careful notes, her pen scratching quietly. When she placed the papers before me, I slipped off my wedding band and set it beside the folder. The metal left a pale circle on my skin, a soft reminder of vows kept long after the man was gone. Would you like to inform your daughter of the changes? She asked. I looked at the window, where the morning light softened against the glass. No, I said. She'll learn when she asks for what isn't hers. Clara nodded once, not in judgment but in understanding. When I signed, my hand did not shake. The pen moved with a steadiness that surprised me, each letter anchoring itself firmly to the page. When it was done, I slipped the ring into my pocket and stood. The air outside smelled of tidewater and thawing earth. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace, a quiet that didn't need permission to last. It was late afternoon when the phone rang, the kind of still hour when light sits softly over the harbor. I was in the garden trimming the lilacs when the sound drifted through the open window. I wiped my hands on my apron before answering. Mom, Delia said, her voice bright and practiced. You sound busy. Just the garden, I said. It's good to hear you. She laughed lightly, the way people do when they are searching for footing. Aaron and I were thinking, she began, that maybe we could spend part of the summer up there. It would be nice to get out of the city for a while. The house by the coast must be beautiful this time of year. Her tone was careful, rehearsed. I could almost hear the script turning in her head. I looked out the window toward the porch. The same boards her father once sanded by hand. I had already imagined this call weeks ago, the moment she would circle back. Not out of reconciliation, but convenience. Didn't I tell you? I said quietly. It's already spoken for. There was a pause, longer than either of us expected. The hum of the line filled the silence. When she spoke again, her voice was tighter. So you're cutting me off? I leaned against the counter, feeling the grain of the wood beneath my palm. No, Delia, I'm setting us both free. She drew in a breath as if to argue, then exhaled instead. The sound was small, almost defeated. Right, she said softly. Well, I guess that's that. Yes, I answered. I guess it is. When the call ended, I set the phone down beside the sink and stood for a long moment, listening to the steady ticking of the clock. The air smelled of salt and lilac. The house quiet except for the low creak of the floor beneath my feet. I opened the window wider, letting the sea breeze move through the room, and breathed until the ache in my chest eased into something gentler, something like release. It was late afternoon when the phone rang, the kind of still hour when light sits softly over the harbor. I was in the garden trimming the lilacs when the sound drifted through the open window. I wiped my hands on my apron before answering. Mom, Delia said, her voice bright and practiced. You sound busy. Just the garden, I said. It's good to hear you. She laughed lightly, the way people do when they are searching for footing. Aaron and I were thinking, she began, that maybe we could spend part of the summer up there. It would be nice to get out of the city for a while. The house by the coast must be beautiful this time of year. Her tone was careful, rehearsed. I could almost hear the script turning in her head. I looked out the window toward the porch. The same boards her father once sanded by hand. I had already imagined this call weeks ago, the moment she would circle back. Not out of reconciliation, but convenience. Didn't I tell you? I said quietly. It's already spoken for. There was a pause. Longer than either of us expected. The hum of the line filled the silence. When she spoke again, her voice was tighter. "So you're cutting me off!" I leaned against the counter, feeling the grain of the wood beneath my palm. "No, Delia, I'm setting us both free." She drew in a breath as if to argue, then exhaled instead. The sound was small, almost defeated. "Right," she said softly. "Well, I guess that's that." "Yes," I answered. "I guess it is." When the call ended, I set the phone down beside the sink and stood for a long moment, listening to the steady ticking of the clock. The air smelled of salt and lilac, the house quiet except for the low creak of the floor beneath my feet. I opened the window wider, letting the sea breeze move through the room, and breathed until the ache in my chest eased into something gentler, something like release. Spring came back to Rockport with a gentler tide that year. The snow melted early, leaving the air soft with salt and earth. By April, the lilacs along my fence were heavy with bloom, their scent drifting through the kitchen whenever I opened the window. I decided to host a small brunch. Something simple, a pot of chowder, scones, and enough coffee to fill the house with warmth. May came first, carrying a pie she had baked that morning. Behind her were June and Margaret, two women from the library circle who had quietly become fixtures in my weeks. They brought laughter that didn't ask for history. We set the table on the porch, mismatched plates gleaming in the pale light. May talked about her grandchildren, June about the seed exchange starting at the community center. The talk was ordinary and light, but it carried a steadiness that had been missing from my home for a long time. Every word seemed to stitch something back together. When I rose to pour more coffee, June noticed the small brass plaque beside the door. She leaned closer to read it aloud. "Welcome by respect," she said, smiling. "That's lovely." It felt right. I told her, a house should only open for kindness. The others nodded, their faces calm and knowing. The piano was gone now, given to a local music teacher who promised to restore it for her students. In its place, by the porch light, hung a wind chime I'd made from its old keys. Each time the breeze shifted, the soft notes rang out faint, uneven, but sweet. May reached across the table and touched my hand. "You've made it peaceful here," she said. I looked around at the garden, at the women sipping coffee, at the light spilling across the floorboards. Peace had arrived quietly, without announcement. Built from mornings like this. It didn't need witnesses or apologies. It only needed to be tended, the way you tend soil after a storm. As the wind moved through the lilacs, the chime played a small tune of its own. I poured another cup and let the sound linger, light as breath, carrying forward into the day that waited beyond the porch.